The gavel struck once, sharp as a crack of thunder, silencing the restless chamber. Every eye turned toward the front as Chief Justice John Roberts leaned forward. His voice measured but firm, slicing through the murmurs that hung like static. In the air, "Representative Crockett," he said, each syllable carrying the authority of centuries of law, "this chamber will not descend into spectacle." The cameras whirred to life, red lights glowing across the room, broadcasting every gesture, every pause, to a nation hungry for drama. Representative Jasmine Crockett adjusted her microphone and raised her chin, her defiance visible even before her words reached the audience. She refused to be dwarfed by the weight of robes or titles. With a flash in her eyes, she fired back, "With respect, Chief Justice, the spectacle began long before I walked in. I'm simply refusing to play along in silence." The chamber stirred, a ripple of whispers moving like wind through tall grass. Reporters leaned in, pens racing across notepads, desperate to capture the first spark of what promised to be an inferno. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson tilted forward, her gaze steady, cutting across the table like a blade honed by years of struggle and triumph. Her voice carried both gravity and steel. "Representative, you claim silence is complicity. But do you understand the weight of what you're suggesting here today?" The room tensed, a taut wire stretched to breaking point. Crockett met Jackson's stare without flinching, her words snapping back with raw intensity. "I understand all too well, Justice Jackson. What I won't do is let authority hide behind ceremony while the people outside beg for truth." A gasp ran through the audience. The clash was no longer a debate. It was a collision of identities, values, and visions for the nation itself. Robert's brow furrowed, Jackson's eyes narrowed, and Crockett's voice rose above the din like a challenge hurled into history. The lights seemed brighter, silence heavier, as though the entire chamber was holding its breath. The balance of power teetered on the edge of a single sentence, waiting for the words that could shatter decorum and redefine the moment. And then, the words that stunned the entire chamber. The confrontation unfolding inside that chamber was more than a heated exchange between powerful figures. It was the collision of two visions of America, one bound by tradition, formality, and the solemn weight of the law, the other fueled by urgency, fire, and the raw demand for accountability. Chief Justice Roberts embodied the gravitas of an institution that has stood for over 2 centuries, cloaked in authority and restraint. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson carried both the weight of history and the spirit of progress, her very presence. On the bench, a living testament to battles fought and won. And across from them, Representative Jasmine Crockett spoke with the passion of a generation tired of waiting, tired of being told that change must come slowly, tired of decorum serving as a veil for silence. Every raised eyebrow, every clipped word was not just about personalities, but about America's core struggle. Who gets to define truth, and who gets to hold power to account? The Supreme Court represented the guardian of law, yet Crockett's voice echoed the people's demand to pierce through the carefully polished surfaces. To some, she was reckless. To others, she was the only one daring enough to shatter the illusion. The stakes were enormous. Cameras broadcast the clash to millions, where families sat in their living rooms. Immigrants replayed clips on their phones, and activists clipped sound bites into viral calls to action. On one side, authority and stability. On the other, rebellion and disruption. This wasn't just about Roberts, Jackson, and Crockett. It was about whether the American promise still belonged to the people, or if it was locked behind the marble columns of power. Whispers in the chamber carried questions that echoed across the nation. Was Roberts protecting the integrity of the institution, or shielding it from scrutiny? Was Jackson a bridge between the law and the people, or would her measured tone risk being drowned out? And was Crockett a truth-teller for a silenced majority, or a provocateur undermining order for spectacle's sake? The air thickened with symbolism. To progressives, Crockett's refusal to bow felt like a spark of resistance against centuries of being told to wait their turn. To traditionalists, Roberts' calm rebuke was a reminder that law without discipline descends into chaos. And in the middle, Jackson represented the fragile, precarious balance America has always wrestled with. Justice that listens, but justice that does not break. This was not an ordinary exchange. It was a mirror held up to America itself, showing the fault lines running through the heart of the nation. Every glare, every word, every interruption carried weight far beyond the walls of the chamber. What played out here would ripple through headlines, social feeds, and late-night conversations for weeks. But this wasn't just about one exchange the deeper. Meaning would ignite a firestorm. Jasmine Crockett had built her reputation on fire. The kind of fire that ignited cable news debates. The kind that set social media ablaze with hashtags, memes, and endless threads dissecting every word she hurled into the public square. To her supporters, she was unapologetic, bold, a voice that refused to shrink in rooms designed to silence dissent. To her critics, she was reckless, brash, a headline chaser who mistook volume for substance. And on this day, as she squared off against two of the nation's most revered judicial figures, her fire burned hotter than ever. There was no mistaking her energy. Crockett leaned forward with sharp gestures, her voice rising, not only to make a point, but to dominate the space itself. For every word Roberts delivered with measured calm, she countered with a quick, biting retort. For every question, Jackson, raised with deliberate pacing, Crockett fired back with raw emotion, determined not to be cornered. In her world, silence was surrender, and she would never surrender. But beneath the passion lay contradictions too obvious to ignore. While she branded herself as a champion of transparency, her past was littered with moments where the pursuit of the spotlight seemed to eclipse the pursuit of clarity. Clips circulated online of her storming out of hearings, cutting off colleagues mid-sentence, and declaring victory in interviews, even when her arguments had unraveled under scrutiny. Her presence on social media became both her weapon and her weakness. Thousands of retweets would fuel her certainty, but the comments beneath often exposed cracks. "She's louder than she is effective," one critic posted. Another replied, "She thrives on chaos because chaos keeps her trending." Her political strategy was a study in contradictions. She demanded accountability from those in power, yet bristled when pressed on her own record. She spoke of unity, yet often left rooms divided and smoldering. In the heat of debate, she wore her defiance like armor, but away from the cameras. Questions lingered about whether the armor was simply covering insecurities she dared not show. On this particular day, Crockett entered the chamber not simply to argue, but to dominate. Every tilt of her chin, every flash of her hand over the microphone, signaled a refusal to yield ground. She thrived on confrontation, because confrontation was her stage, and the louder the clash, the more she believed the audience would side with her courage. But courage unchecked can easily transform into arrogance. As the nation watched, that arrogance began to seep through. Crockett dismissed Roberts' warnings with a wave of her hand, as if centuries of judicial tradition were little more than an inconvenience. She met Jackson's steady gaze with defiance, unwilling to recognize that patience and composure could carry more weight than passion alone. Her energy was undeniable, but it teetered on the edge of self-destruction. In the age of viral clips, Crockett knew exactly how to craft her moments. She emphasized words designed to trend, delivered one-liners meant for instant replay, and turned pauses into theater. Yet the very tools that made her powerful also exposed her. Viewers saw the calculation, the eagerness to go viral at any cost, and began to wonder whether the performance served the people or simply her own ambition. The chamber grew tense, not just because of what she said, but how she said it. She seemed less interested in persuading than in overpowering, less focused on solutions than on spectacle. And while spectacle drew cameras, it also drew doubt. Could this fiery performance sustain itself against the cold, relentless weight of the law? Could raw defiance stand unbroken in the face of voices forged in discipline, history, and justice? Crockett believed it could. She believed her fire was enough to scorch through tradition, enough to topple composure with sheer intensity. History is unforgiving to arrogance. Even the brightest fire can burn itself out when it forgets that. Flames need fuel, but arrogance has a way of meeting its match. Chief Justice John Roberts, and Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson could not be more different in their journeys. Yet on this day, in this chamber, their paths converged into a single purpose: to embody the dignity of law and the resilience of truth. Against the storms of arrogance, Roberts, the custodian of tradition, carried with him the weight of decades spent within the intricate gears of America's legal machinery. Born into modest circumstances in Buffalo, he was never handed power. He earned it by poring over case law late into the night, shaping arguments with precision and refusing shortcuts. His calm voice was not the product of privilege alone. It was the voice of a man who learned that restraint, patience, and discipline could steady even the most turbulent debates. Behind the black robe was not a man hungry for headlines, but one committed to preserving the fragile scaffolding of democracy itself. And then there was Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, whose very name had already etched itself into American history. Raised in a family that believed deeply in education and public service, she was the daughter of parents who carried the stories of civil rights struggles in their veins. She had faced the quiet sting of doubters, the whispered suggestions that she did not belong, the invisible walls placed before her because of the color of her skin and the weight of her identity. Yet through every test, she had risen higher, not by bending to bitterness, but by transforming struggle into strength. Her journey to the Supreme Court was not a coronation. It was a victory wrestled from centuries of exclusion. Both Roberts and Jackson understood sacrifice, though in different keys. Roberts gave up the freedom of being merely a scholar or a commentator to shoulder the unrelenting responsibility of guiding the highest court. Every ruling, every word would be dissected, twisted, and debated. Yet he chose to bear that scrutiny because he believed in the institution he served. Jackson's sacrifices were more personal, threaded into her daily life. To succeed, she often had to be twice as prepared, twice as composed, twice as unshakable. Each milestone carried the weight of representation, of showing millions of young girls and boys of color that the impossible could, in fact, be reached. Together, their moral compasses pointed in the same direction, toward justice that was not loud but enduring, not performative but real. Roberts believed that the legitimacy of the court depended not on bluster, but on steadiness. Jackson believed that justice must not only be done, but must be seen to honor the humanity of those who too often felt unheard. The contrasts with Crockett could not have been sharper. Where she thrived on volume, they thrived on presence. Where she sought to dominate, they sought to uphold. Where her fire risked burning indiscriminately, their light shone with precision, guiding rather than scorching. It was not just their titles that gave them power in that chamber, it was their stories. Roberts, who embodied the idea that discipline and order could preserve a fragile republic. Jackson, who embodied the idea that resilience and identity could rewrite what that republic included. Their struggles had forged in them a strength that was quieter than Crockett's, but infinitely more durable. The nation saw it too. Two immigrants watching, Jackson's rise was proof that barriers could fall. Two families seeking stability, Roberts' calm was reassurance that institutions would not collapse in the face of noise. Together, they represented not only law, the very idea that America was still capable of dignity in the face of discord. And on this day, dignity would be tested. Crockett's energy was relentless, but Roberts' patience was ironclad. Jackson's voice, steady and unflinching, carried the resonance of lived struggle. Both were prepared not just to debate, but to absorb every blow, to turn chaos into clarity, to show that truth does not need to shout to be heard. As the chamber braced for what would come, the weight of their stories hung in the air. They had been shaped by struggle, armed with sacrifice, anchored by a moral compass that refused to bend. And in the clash that was about to erupt, those qualities would become their greatest weapons. For when arrogance rises, it takes more than fire to answer it. It takes dignity. It takes resilience. It takes truth made flesh. And Roberts and Jackson were ready. The chamber had become a theater. Every word another act in a drama that felt too raw to script. Representative Jasmine Crockett leaned closer to her microphone, her voice rising above the shuffle of papers and the faint coughs of restless observers. "You speak of order," she declared, her tone sharp enough to cut through the air. "But what is order if it only protects the powerful and silences the rest?"
Out.
The words landed like sparks on dry kindling. Murmurs spread across the room. Reporters typing frantically, eyes darting between the bench and the congresswoman who refused to bow. Crockett was not merely debating. She was performing, shaping each line for the audience beyond the marble walls for the millions watching on screens. Would decide whether her defiance was reckless or righteous. Chief Justice John Roberts did not flinch. He adjusted his glasses, folded his hands on the desk before him, and spoke with a calmness that made Crockett's rising volume seem almost theatrical. "Representative, passion cannot substitute for principle," he said, his words deliberate, each pause forcing the room to hang on his meaning. "This chamber has endured because it separates heat from reason. When heat overwhelms, reason disappears, and the people are left with nothing but noise." The contrast was striking. Crockett, fiery and urgent; Roberts, cool and composed. But it was Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson who shifted the tone from tension to confrontation. She leaned forward, her voice carrying the resonance of authority sharpened by experience. "Representative Crockett," she said, her eyes locking onto the congresswoman, "if you claim to speak for those without power, then tell us what. Do you propose when passion runs so hot that truth itself becomes distorted? Who speaks then, and who listens?" The room hushed. Crockett's lips parted, her expression caught between defiance and calculation. Then, like a flame refusing to be smothered, she erupted once more. "I'll tell you who speaks, those of us who refuse to be silenced. Those of us tired of the same polished words from polished people, while families outside this building beg for justice that never arrives. You talk about noise?
Out.
Noise is the only way to break through your silence." A murmur of approval rippled from a pocket of spectators in the gallery, but just as quickly, a wave of disapproval swept in from another corner. The clash was no longer confined to the three figures. It was spreading, pulling the entire chamber into its orbit. Roberts lifted his gavel, striking once to calm the storm. His eyes narrowed, his tone still level but tinged with steel. "Representative, this chamber is not a stage for spectacle. If you believe noise is a substitute for justice, then history will judge that choice harshly." Crockett shot back without hesitation. "And history will judge you for standing in silence while people suffer." The eruption drew gasps, pens pausing mid-scribble, cameras zooming in on faces caught between shock and awe. Jackson's gaze sharpened, her voice steady but cutting. "Representative, the measure of justice is not in how loud we shout, but in how faithfully we serve. Can you honestly claim your defiance today serves the people, or does it serve yourself?" The silence that followed was heavy, electric, as if the room itself leaned forward, waiting for Crockett's answer. She tightened her grip on the microphone, her jaw set, determination flashing in her eyes. But the next exchange flipped the room. Upside down, the silence after Jackson's pointed question stretched like a wire pulled to its breaking point. A moment, the chamber seemed suspended in time. No one moved. No one dared whisper. All eyes bore down on Representative Jasmine Crockett, who gripped her microphone as if it were both shield and sword. Her lips parted, searching for the words that would match the gravity of the question. But before sound could escape, Chief Justice John Roberts spoke. His voice was low, even, almost quiet, but the weight of it filled every corner of the chamber. "Representative Crockett," he began, his tone so measured it forced the audience to lean in. "You mistake defiance for duty. Noise may command attention, but it does not command respect. And when respect dies, so too does justice." A shiver of murmurs rippled through the room. Cameras tightened their focus on Roberts, capturing the rare moment when the Chief Justice abandoned judicial reserve for the sharp edge of rebuke. Crockett's eyes widened, her jaw tightening as though the words had struck deeper than she'd anticipated. Roberts continued, his cadence deliberate, each pause landing like the thud of a gavel. "For generations, leaders have stood in these halls and argued with fire. But passion alone has never sustained this republic. It is not volume that preserves freedom, it is principle. It is not spectacle that delivers justice, it is sacrifice. He leaned back slightly, the barest shift in posture carrying more authority than any raised voice could. And if we reduce this chamber to theater, then we will betray the very people you claim to serve. Gasps cut through the silence. Some in the gallery nodded, others exchanged glances of disbelief. Crockett's face hardened, her nostrils flaring as she readied her rebuttal. Yet before she could strike back, justice. Ketanji Brown Jackson entered the fray, her words like tempered steel. "Representative Crockett," Jackson said, her voice neither raised nor rushed. "You speak as though you alone carry the weight of the people's pain. But pain is not a license to abandon discipline. Struggle is not an excuse to drown out reason. I know something of struggle, and I know this. If we confuse noise with truth, we will leave the people with neither." The chamber seemed to inhale collectively, holding its breath as Jackson's words hung in the air. Her tone was not one of condemnation, but of challenge and invitation for Crockett to reckon with the deeper meaning of her defiance. Crockett leaned in, her voice sharp, almost desperate now. "So what would you have me do, Justice? Sit quietly while families suffer? Speak politely while nothing changes? History doesn't remember the whispers, it remembers the shouts." Jackson's gaze did not falter. Her reply came with the precision of a blade. History remembers courage, yes, but it also remembers wisdom. Rosa Parks was quiet when she refused to move. Dr. King was steady when he spoke of a dream. Courage is not measured in decibels. Representative, it is measured in dignity. The room erupted in gasps and scattered applause, the lines slicing through the tension like lightning. Crockett's lips pressed together, her frustration visible, her defiance shaken, but not extinguished. She reached again for her microphone, her voice cracking slightly under the pressure. "Dignity doesn't get you heard. Dignity doesn't stop injustice in its tracks." Roberts leaned forward once more, his tone calm but final, like the closing of a door. "Dignity is the only thing that outlasts injustice. Noise fades. Representative, spectacle fades. But dignity endures. Long after this moment has passed, the people will not remember how loudly you shouted. They will remember whether you stood with respect for the truth, or whether you surrendered it for applause." The gallery fell into stunned silence. Crockett's eyes darted toward the cameras, as if to find refuge in the lens that had so often rewarded her bravado. This time, the silence was louder than any cheer. The stillness carried more weight than any trending clip. Jackson, sensing the turning of the tide, delivered the final strike, her words resonant with quiet power. "Representative, your voice is strong, no one denies it. But the measure of strength is not whether you can shout over others, it is whether you can stand for what is right when the shouting stops. That is what the people deserve. That is what justice demands." Crockett leaned back, visibly rattled. Her fingers tapped nervously against the desk, her eyes narrowing, her breath heavy. The cameras captured it all, the defiance now tinged with doubt, the fire tempered by the realization that she had been cornered, not by louder voices, but by steadier ones. The chamber itself seemed transformed. Reporters stared wide-eyed, aware they had just witnessed a moment destined for history books or at least for endless replay on screens across the country. Even the murmurs had died away, replaced by a silence so complete it was almost sacred. For a few long seconds, no one spoke. The Chief Justice and the Associate Justice sat with the calm of victors who did not need to gloat. Their composure, a mirror of the very values they had defended. Crockett adjusted her papers, her usual certainty replaced with a restlessness that betrayed her inner turmoil. And then, almost as if on cue, the chamber seemed to exhale. Pens scribbled, cameras clicked, phones lit up as clips were instantly uploaded. Hashtags already forming in the digital ether. The confrontation was far from over. But the tide had shifted. The decisive moment had come and gone, and its shockwaves were already racing outward. Unstoppable. The internet exploded within minutes, the moment Roberts and Jackson delivered their Calm but devastating rebuke did not end when the gavel struck. In truth, it had only just begun. Within minutes of the exchange, the chamber footage was clipped, subtitled, and uploaded across every corner of the internet. The first TikTok video. Roberts leaning in with that devastating line about dignity enduring longer than noise hit 1 million views before the committee had even adjourned. On X, hashtags ignited like wildfire. Hashtag dignity endures. Hashtag Roberts vs. Crockett and hashtag Justice Jackson trended side by side. Memes poured in at breakneck speed. One showed Crockett shouting into a void, while Roberts, drawn as a stone statue, sat unmoved. Another paired Jackson's quiet invocation of Rosa Parks with a roaring crowd, texted simply with, "Power in. Calm." Even on Instagram, a reel stitched together Crockett's red-faced intensity against Roberts' steady gaze. The caption reading, "Noise versus truth, who wins?" The answer, for many viewers, was obvious. YouTube channels dedicated to political commentary rushed to upload breakdowns. Thumbnails screamed in bold fonts, "Crockett destroyed Liv," while progressive creators embraced the moment as proof that dignity could triumph over rage. By the evening, the confrontation had spread beyond the usual political circles. Reaction videos poured in from lifestyle vloggers, comedians, and even international commentators, each astonished by how swiftly the clash had escalated and then flipped on its head. The shockwaves rippled through the political class as well. Supporters of Crockett praised her fire, framing her as a warrior unwilling to bow before institutional power. "She spoke for the people," one ally tweeted, while Roberts lectured from an ivory tower. Yet even among her defenders there was unease. The clip of her defiance now looked less like strength and more like stubbornness, unraveling in the face of poise. Meanwhile, Roberts was hailed across bipartisan lines as the embodiment of judicial steadiness. Conservative pundits praised his sharpness, celebrating that he had finally shed the robe of restraint. But it was Jackson who emerged as the night's unexpected star. Progressives flooded social media with clips of her lines about Rosa Parks and Dr. King, branding her as the voice of moral authority. One viral tweet read, "Jackson reminded us that true power whispers," and everyone listened. Celebrities, too, weighed in. A-list actors retweeted clips with captions like "chills." Musicians posted lyrics alongside Jackson's quotes. Even athletes joined the conversation. An NBA star posted her line about dignity outlasting noise with the simple facts. The confrontation had leaped from the marble halls of Washington into the bloodstream of popular culture. Morphing from a committee hearing into a cultural touchstone, Crockett, refusing to retreat, doubled down in a live stream later that evening. Her voice trembled with fury as she accused Roberts and Jackson of condescension. "They think calm words solve real pain," she said to her followers. "But calm doesn't stop injustice." She vowed to keep shouting, keep disrupting, keep fighting. Yet even as she spoke, the comments filled with mixed reactions. Some hailed her for refusing to bow. Others urged her to reflect, quoting Jackson's words back at her, "Courage is measured in dignity." The clash had escaped the narrow walls of political debate and become something bigger, referendum on style itself. Was American leadership about fire, volume, and confrontation? Or was it about composure, principle, and endurance? Social media was not just replaying the confrontation. It was reframing it into a story about America's identity. By the next morning, late-night hosts were replaying the clips. One comedian mimicking Crockett's booming voice, then lowering into Roberts' calm baritone for contrast. The audience erupted in laughter, but the takeaway was clear. The imagery had cemented itself. Crockett's fire was unforgettable, but Roberts and Jackson's poise would be immortalized, and so the moment transcended the event itself. It became a parable, a cultural Rorschach test. To some, it was proof that the system silences righteous anger. To others, it was validation that dignity and discipline remain America's truest strengths. Either way, the confrontation had grown larger than any single player, larger even than the hearing itself. It had become a battle over how power should look, how justice should sound, and how America should remember itself. But as the world argued, posted, laughed, and cried. One question lingered louder than any meme or headline. If this was the spark, what kind of firestorm would it ignite next? As the dust settled and the frenzy of reactions surged beyond the chamber walls, the figures at the center of it all stood with a clarity that cut through the noise. Chief Justice Roberts, measured and deliberate, seized the moment, not with another rebuke, but with a reflection that echoed into history. His words were simple, but they carried the full weight of centuries of law and memory. Power is not the loudest voice in the room, it is the one that endures. The cameras caught his expression as he said it, the faintest trace of sorrow in his eyes, as though he understood the temptation of anger but refused to allow it to define the nation's story. And then Justice Jackson, calm yet resolute, carried the meaning further. She reminded the chamber, and by extension the country, that America's greatest triumphs had never come from volume or spectacle, but from sacrifice and vision. She spoke of those who marched without weapons, who sat quietly in defiance, who endured insults and blows without returning them, and yet transformed the nation. Her words were not lofty abstractions, but living reminders that justice is not performance, it is persistence. Equality is not shouted into being, it is carved into reality by those who refuse to be broken. The room hushed. For a brief, fleeting moment, partisan lines and ideological divisions seemed to dissolve. Even those who disagreed felt the pull of her truth. It was not about Crockett's fire or Robert's gavel, it was about the deeper current that runs beneath American life, the belief that dignity, when held long enough, bends the arc toward justice. Social media, still ablaze, latched onto this sentiment. Clips of Jackson's remarks spread not only as political content, but as inspirational mantras. Educators replayed them in classrooms, parents shared them with children, activists held them up at rallies. The clash that had begun as a confrontation of egos had transformed into a lesson about what kind of strength America should honor. And this was the true resolution, the recognition that arrogance may dazzle for a moment, but composure endures for generations. Shouting may win the room, but dignity wins history. Crockett's fire was not forgotten, but Roberts and Jackson's composure gave it context, reframed it, and ultimately outlasted it. Jackson closed her remarks with a line that would be repeated, long after the headlines faded. In moments like these, America remembers who we are. The words rang not as scolding, but as an invitation, a call to the country to rise above division, to see itself again in the mirror of justice and equality, to choose dignity over arrogance, substance over noise. And as the gavel finally fell, the story was no longer just about three individuals locked in confrontation. It was about a nation reckoning with itself, a reminder that America's promise, fragile though it may be, remains strongest when it is guarded not by the loudest, but by the steadfast. The clash that began as Roberts and Jackson versus Crockett will be remembered as far more than a heated exchange. It became the symbol of truth confronting chaos, of calm authority standing firm against the storm. What millions witnessed in that chamber was not simply a political moment, but a lesson etched in real time. Dignity will always outweigh arrogance. Law will always stand taller than noise, and America's promise must always rise above ego. For viewers, the takeaway was unmistakable. Crockett's fire may have captured attention, but it was Robert's composure and Jackson's piercing clarity that captured respect. The debate proved what history has shown time and again: power only earns legitimacy when it submits itself to justice. When arrogance collides with integrity, integrity does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. And yet that whisper outlasts every shout. This is the essence of inside power, exposing the drama, showdowns, and the human flaws, but always revealing the deeper truth beneath the noise. Because in America, the fight is never just about today's headlines, it's about the story we choose to tell ourselves as a nation. And now, the choice is yours. If you believe that truth deserves a platform louder than arrogance, if you believe that power must always answer to justice, then don't just watch from the sidelines. Subscribe to Inside Power and join a community that demands dignity, values justice, and isn't afraid to confront the chaos head-on. The story doesn't end here. It begins with you. Subscribe now and together. Let's make sure America remembers who we are.